in thinking about this final panel, there was a sense of, well, this is the moment when there'll be a kind of real focus on Turner's contemporary legacies and the way in which contemporary artists engage with and think about Turner. Actually, in the event, this has been a theme and a possibility almost from the go. I mean, over the last 2 days, those of us who've been with us for the full 2 days would have seen contemporary artists repeatedly crop up as mediators, as reflectors, as interpreters of Turner's work. So we follow the format of our other sessions with 20-minute papers. We'll run through the 5 papers, and yeah, if you could take your seats, the session starting, followed by a Q&A session. There is a comfort break scheduled in between, so there'll be a brief break, and then after the Q&A, we have a reading from Cal Barton, and then we'll be closing the conference as a whole, aiming to finish at, I think it's 5 o'clock, isn't it? Is our kind of closing point. Okay, so if we get panel 5, Artistic Legacies, started, and we're starting with a paper from Nicole Cochrane, who is Assistant Curator of British Art 1790 to 1850 here at Tate Britain. Nicole completed an AHRC-funded PhD at the University of Hull in 2019, and her research focuses on collecting histories. But today is going to talk about encounters at MoMA, Turner, Rothko, and the invention of Modernist. So, Nicole.
I'm scared of the clicker, so hopefully I don't fall into the trap of everyone else today. So there's a story often repeated here at Tate of a fateful encounter between Mark Rothko and J.M.W. Turner. It goes that Rothko, upon being confronted by the similarities between Turner's late works and his own, remarked, "This man Turner learned a lot from me." And it's a tale perfect for contemporary museum interpretation and display. So it's an interaction between historic and contemporary, figurative and abstract, the old world and the new, connecting art transhistorically through this kind of very personal interaction. And it also speaks perfectly to the way that Turner is often described in kind of contemporary discourse and perhaps marketed by places such as Tate, a historic artist who was ahead of his time and foresaw the advent of modernism, experimentation and exploration. And this idea of Turner as a sort of proto-modernist also influences how we engage with him in galleries and museum display. Tate, Rothko and Turner are in permanent dialogue in our Clore gallery, which I'm sure many of you have seen, where late works by Turner, such as Norham Castle, though not at the moment because Norham Castle's in the exhibition, sits beside Rothko to illustrate the ways that both artists explore form, colour, space and light. And indeed, this is the entire concept of a current touring Tate exhibition called Turner's Sublime Legacy, or Dialogues with Turner, depending on where you see it, which looks at the very different aspects of Turner's engagement with the sublime through various lenses, so weather, the sea, travel, etc. The exhibition purposely places Turner, a historic artist, with contemporary works in direct conversation, creating this transhistorical dialogue of the sublime. And it's unsurprising that the picture on the left there, which is Rothko and Turner together, is kind of one of the most celebrated dualities of the exhibition. And I've always been interested in this idea of legacies and how personal interaction in museums impacts the way we understand art. And at Tate, particularly in a year in which Turner's legacy is kind of omnipresent for us at the moment here in Team Turner, I'm especially interested in the way that our gallery spaces tell this story to the public. In displaying Turner beside Rothko, what are we saying about the paintings of both artists? What are we ignoring? And what are we potentially spinning for our own purposes? In this paper, I'm going to kind of unpack why we're so attached to the idea of Turner as a modern artist, when and where this narrative, I think, began, and the sort of lasting impact of it, and importantly, what this means for contemporary museum display. And my paper is going to use this fateful encounter between Rothko and Turner in 1966 at the exhibition Turner, Imagination and Reality as kind of the key linchpin of that. So the period from Turner's death and the MoMA exhibition of 1966 was a time in which Turner's reputation and public discourse on the nature and value of his art was in probably near constant flux. As I imagine most in the room today know, in the immediate aftermath of Turner's death, Ruskin emerged as kind of the chief champion of his legacy. While Ruskin's approach to Turner was also quite changeable and fluctuated for much of his career, the dominant narrative which emerged was his appreciation for the artist. that Turner was an artist of poetic sentiment who saw nature beyond purely intimative. But despite that, his apparent position at the vanguard of landscape painting, his distaste for Turner's particularly late works, which he termed nonsense pictures, affirmed narrative of his kind of waning ability and eyesight in his late years. By the start of the 20th century, critics like Walter Armstrong began to reassess his work and placed him in direct comparison with particularly the Impressionists. But for critics like Armstrong in particular, his interest in light and colour and line, which he thought several people thought brought him to the front of the avant-garde, actually left him quite in wanting. It was Roger Fry who, in particularly in the aftermath of Armstrong's critiques, that becomes sort of Turner's late legacy chief critic. Fry's criticism in particular said that Turner was too concerned with the making of art and being popular on the art market, which resulted in his painting being devoid of feeling, something that Fry argues was apparent in other artists, particularly Constable. Writing, quote, "Everything else is sacrificed to the collection of picturesque or romantic incidents, marked by thin and exaggerated accents. There is no trace of the suave masses and harmonised silhouettes of his earlier work. He has become a sensationalist and exhibition painter." And similarly, critic Clement Greenberg would write of Turner that he, quote, "at his very best does not match Constable's best, nor is he as important to subsequent major painting. If anything, he is more important to subsequent bad painting." And in particular, critics often point to a Turner's adoption and later abandonment by the Impressionists and the Neo-Impressionists like Monet and Pissarro as a damning criticism of his value as a modern artist. While a paper in itself could probably be given on the critical nature of Turner in the 20th century, one main thread emerges, an uncertainty of what to think of Turner's late and unfinished pictures. Were they experiments in abstraction, an artist creating an almost prophetic vision of what was art to come, or did they sit uneasy with his earlier, more formalised exhibition paintings and potentially something to be begotten? Was Turner an artist perhaps like Constable to provide lessons for future generations, or to be left in the past? And importantly, the first half of the 20th century was also a time that was fraught for Tate. In the 1950s, it was particularly a transitional period. World War II had sustained large amounts of damage to the building, as we heard earlier, the flood of 1928. And in the aftermath of the war, the gallery did not become fully operational again until the early 1950s. Throughout the 60s, Turner was also in the process of being officially transferred from the National Gallery to Tate, and this formal designation between the two collections was ratified. Importantly, a lot of these works were actually in an less than ideal state of conservation, with an estimated 159 oil paintings reportedly needing major conservation projects in 1964. However, what this meant for the public was there was a steady stream of almost, I guess, new or uncovered Turners to be put on display, at least to them. So in 1955, the formal separation between the National Gallery and the now Tate Gallery was formalised, and the demarcations of their collection remits were now solidified, something kind of now in flux by the National Gallery's new extension. For Tate, this meant its collecting policies of historic British art, as well as being the home of foreign modern art, was clearly defined for the first time. However, notably, critics at the time were very sceptical of this, questioning whether Tate had the ability to combine these two seemingly disparate collections within one space. One wonders perhaps if we maybe proved them right by separating British and global contemporary art with the invent of Tate Modern in 2000. So it's important to see that the time that Turner at the MoMA in 1966 was born was a context in which Tate was also grappling to establish itself not only as separate and distinct from the National Gallery, but also its ability to be a steward of both historic and contemporary art. Meanwhile, almost concurrently with these debates, critics are debating whether or not to justify Turner's position as a modern and contemporary artist, or have artist relevance. So the idea of an exhibition of Turner's work in New York at MoMA was first proposed by William Seitz, who was curator of painting and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Seitz had recently overseen an exhibition of works by Monet in 1960, and he believed that Turner was a logical follow-up to that in the early 1960s. The exhibition would initially be stalled and was later spearheaded by Monroe Wheeler, who was director of exhibitions for 1966. Importantly, MoMA worked specifically in collaboration with Tate, particularly Norman Reed, who had become director in 1964. Reed had trained as a painter and was particularly sympathetic to modern and contemporary art, and significantly expanded Tate's holdings in this area. Reed had also overseen the appointment of fellow artist curator Lawrence Gowing as Keeper of British Art in 1965. The Tate-MoMA collaboration would be titled Turner, Imagination and Reality. Gowing presided over the selection and curation of the works and authored the catalogue solely. Despite this, MoMA clearly had a very strong level of input, with Wheeler sending Tate a list of potential loans in 1965 that they wished to include. The list, which is now preserved in Tate's archives, shows their focus was firmly on Turner's late works, showing that MoMA had a clear vision of what the narrative of the exhibition would be, and firmly sitting Tate within this realm of modernism. The exhibition included 100 works by Turner, including 39 oil paintings, 60 works on paper, which were mostly watercolours. The vast majority of the works came from the Tate collection, and it was the largest loan exhibition that Tate had done at that time. All but 2 of the oil paintings dated after 1828, and the majority of them were Turner's late unfinished paintings and sketches. Interestingly, the original title of the exhibition had reportedly been Turner Pictures of Nothing, which was a quote that William Hazlitt had reportedly described of Turner's art. It suggests this narrative that the theme would be to suggest Turner's late works were a return to abstraction and abandonment of form. The catalogue for the exhibition would affirm this, writing, quote, "In his 40s, proud, rich and idiosyncratic, he, Turner, found himself revolutionising his art, eliminating it from linear draftsmanship and the classical composition, glorifying only light and shade by the sole means of colour." The exhibition went as far as to literally reframe Turner to suit its new setting. Joyce mentioned yesterday that a lot of Turner's late works were unframed at this time, and new unobstructive, simple gold frames were created for a lot of Turner's late works, which I will come back to. In a letter by curator William Seitz, he notes, "If the pictures were entirely separated from the historical context which the great old frame give, they would have a life and freshness otherwise impossible." And to quote Sam Smiles, Turner would be, quote, "shorn from his historical context and free to take his place in what many regarded as the museum epicenter of the modern movement." So I think the message of the exhibition was very clear. This was a new, modern and bold Turner ready to meet a new generation. The exhibition opened to great acclaim on the 23rd of March 1966 and gained the highest number of visitors the MoMA had seen for that time. The exhibition was extended by a month to accommodate this higher visitor number. And when questioned why the MoMA was a venue for a Turner exhibition, Monroe Wheeler reportedly replied, quote, "Because I know a modern painter when I see one." The key ethos of the exhibition was not to suggest that modern artists were directly influenced by Turner, but rather to show that there were links and approaches and methods in his use of light and colour, etc., that predated modern abstract painting. In the catalogue, Gowing would write, quote, "Presumably none of the present-day abstract painters whose principal means of expression is light and colour had Turner and his life work in mind. But looking back upon their revolution, more than 100 years later than his, we see a kinship." And this kind of trans-historical kinship was certainly received positively, with New York critic Robert Pincus Whitten writing, "It is hardly necessary to recall today just how much late Turner influenced abstract expressionism. Turner was a watchword figure 10 years ago whose paintings were assiduously studied and admired." So if critics like Fry and Greenberg had abandoned Turner as a precursor to the Impressionist, Turner, Imagination and Reality instead helped a new wave of critics to make him at the vanguard of the abstract expressionists instead. And of course, at the centre of that sat Mark Rothko. So returning to that famous interaction, the reason why he said this was because Mark Rothko had been invited to view Turner, Imagination and Reality personally by director Norman Reed in early 1966. This was not the first interaction between the two. Rothko at this point was quite a famous and influential artist and had been courted by Reed for several years for a potential acquisition for Tate. Reed had visited the artist in his studio just the year before with the view of acquiring works for the gallery. Indeed, Reed and Rothko seem to have developed quite a close friendship, and in my research through to Tate archives, the correspondence also reveals a slightly fraught relationship depending on this time. Through the discussions, the nature of Rothko's gift to Turner fluctuated, and interestingly, at the one point, the entire contents of Rothko's 1961 Whitechapel retrospective was considered as a gift, but politely declined due for fear of storage and exhibition space, something which I imagine my colleagues in the modern team are very upset about. In particular, the narrative suggested by numerous publications since this fated meeting, and even what we at Tate kind of talk about, is that Rothko's subsequent relationship and gift to Tate was born out of his interaction with Turner Imagination and Reality, when reportedly Reed gave Rothko a tour, and Rothko explained, "That man Turner learned a lot from me." And interestingly, about looking into this anecdote, that this comes directly from Reed himself. The first mention I can find comes from a memo composed by Reed in a file relating to the acquisition of Rothko's Seagram murals. In here he writes, quote, "As to Turner, I am sure Rothko felt a kinship with him, and his gift was certainly influenced by Turner's presence at the gallery. At the opening of the show of late Turner paintings in New York, he jokingly said to me, pointing at one of the most abstract sky and sea watercolours, 'That chap Turner learned a lot from me.' I want to know why chap turned to man." In the following years, Rothko and Reed regularly corresponded on the final selection works, would continue, and the ultimate selection would be Rothko's Seagram murals. And thus, a perfect art historical myth was born. Rothko, enamoured by Turner's works and convinced of his relationship to the artist, wanted his work to hang alongside those of Turner, an artist that he saw an affinity with. However, I think this kind of ignores the implications of Reed's prior discussions with Rothko, and additionally, the extensive letters between Reed and Rothko contain no real references to Turner specifically. While Rothko certainly saw Tate in its collection as a revered institution, of which Turner was a central part, it's likely that Turner was not the chief motivation of this for the artist. There is a specific mention in the letters of his wish to have his work given their own space, something that Reed reminds him that few artists in the collection were offered, such as in Pride of Place, Turner and Picasso being the main ones. From this correspondence, it's clear that Rothko saw it important that his works were at Tate rather than strictly with Turner. In 1965, immediately following the Gowing exhibition, the works of the Turner wing were rehung in a new display which clearly was influenced by the MoMA display, and this was overseen by Gowing, who was at the time Tate's Keeper of British Art. Importantly for this story, by the 60s, Tate's space was quickly beginning to run out, something that is constantly battling museums. Importantly, also these early arguments of the appropriateness of Tate for a home of both historic and contemporary art was beginning to be kind of reinvigorated. And thus several internal discussions concerned with how to manage this kind of shift in Tate's reputation began. This spearheaded by Norman Reed, these included a proposal to move Tate's statue of Millet, which is now at the back of the gallery, but had originally been at the front, and also a scheme to replace Tate's neoclassical facade with a new extension in a contemporary style, with Reed reportedly saying, quote, "The old facade is rather like the massive frames of the period. It pays impressive tribute to art, yet eventually becomes a burden to it." While this thankfully, I think, never came about, it kind of hints to the issue of relevance of historic art to contemporary audiences, and was perhaps fulfilled by the Clore extension which we now sit in by James Sterling in the 1980s. Inside the gallery, by 1967, the redisplay of Turner intended to give him his own kind of spatially distinct space, with Reed writing that it aimed to allow visitors to, quote, "see Turner's originality in a less limiting and restrictive setting than the architecture and the frames of the later 19th century. And as a result, the new Turner galleries echoed much of the MoMA spaces. Turner's home was a similarly kind of white cube space, with sleek, unadorned white walls breaking into spaces, into individual bays. High ceilings were replaced with muslin, which diffused the light closer to the paintings. This created a much more intimate setting for Turner's work and presented the works within this kind of what we would think as modernist setting. In particular, like MoMA, it invited viewers to see Turner as though he was a contemporary artist. An important part of this new display scheme was that Turner's earliest paintings, particularly those exhibited pre-1918, were actually not displayed in the Turner galleries, and instead were included in the displays of historic works elsewhere in the gallery. This meant that now Turner's work of these late unfinished sketches were given a space which had previously not been privileged. Gowing wished to claim Turner as a true original and center him, therefore, in his role at Tate as the origin point from which modern painting could find its source. While writing that he was, quote, "no one's ancestor, he was the first and in some ways the loneliest of the recognisably modern painters." Compared to his reputation at the first half of the 20th century, Gowing attempted to rehabilitate Turner's approach to landscape and nature. Instead of the synthetic, he praises Turner's use of imagination. His surrendering to colour and form goes beyond the observation of the world around him. And perhaps the lasting legacy of Gowing's reshaping of Turner is in these reframings themselves. Indeed, these specific gowing frames, and I'm very thankful for my colleague Alistair in Frame Conservation for telling me this, these are known as gowing frames, created specifically for Turner and Imagination, and they still adorn Turner's late works today. While I certainly never want to cause Tate to lose our favourite story of the fated interaction between Mark Rothko and Turner, I hope I've helped to show that Turner's paintings and legacy are something which has always been inextricably linked to the way which curators, artists and visitors have attempted to bring him to the fore. Perhaps the most striking example of the way in which this exhibition helped to shape the legacy of Turner that we have today, and the long-reaching arm of the exhibition can see in the way that we exhibit Turner. It's unsurprising that looking at the lineup of recent exhibitions, and indeed our own, which uses Turner's Burning of the Houses of Parliament from 1834, which blazes on the cover, all of these works are Turner's late and often unfinished paintings. I wonder if perhaps in the coming decades or centuries, new curators or historians will cause a similar shift, and a conference in 50 years will instead have Dido building Carthage or fishermen at sea as their poster boy instead. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nicole, for fantastic digging around in the Tate archive there and having a bit of a poke at some of the legacies and some of the myths around Tate and its role in Turner reputation. So thank you for that. We'll move straight on now to our next paper, which is from Ed Kettleborough. Ed is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Bristol, where he's also teaching, where his research focuses on the generation of artists emerging through the RCA in the 1960s, and kind of thinking afresh about their role in art history. He was formerly convener of the Doctoral Researchers Network, run by Paul Mellon Centre, and he's now chair of the Association of Art Historians Committee of Early Career Researchers. And today, he's going to be talking about Turner, Frank Bowling, and the subject of modernism. So, Ed.
Thank you, Martin. And like everyone else, I wanted to start by echoing the thanks to Paul Mellon Centre, the Turner Society, who very kindly sponsored my paper, and to the Tate more broadly for organising this. But I also wanted to extend kind of more particular thanks, which is to say I had the great fortune of attending a panel organised by Richard Johns, Nick Robbins and Jeremy Melius called After Turner at the Association of Art History Annual Conference in York in April of this year. And I heard an earlier version of Nicole's paper, and hopefully you'll see the interaction between my thoughts and hers. But also Amy's closing reflections were kind of key, and also a wonderful paper by Caroline Arscott and Claire Pettit. I'm dreading this this clicker, but we'll see how it goes. Oh God. Okay, we'll go back to that. Pairing the work of J.M.W. Turner with the paintings of Frank Bowling has now become something of an art historical and curatorial cliché. As exemplified by the Royal Academy's seminal Entangled Past in 2024, the dialogue is most often articulated by coupling Bowling's map paintings, which are a series of works he made in New York between around 1967 and 1972, with Turner's slave ship. As Ogwuyen-Wezo wrote in 2017, if Turner was the painter of the English Sublime, it could be stated that Bowling was the master of the diasporic Sublime. The key reference point is Paul Gilroy's theory of the Black Atlantic, in which the slave ship comes to embody not only a sublime invocation of racial terror, commerce, and England's ethico-political degeneration, but also the ship as the living means by which the points within that Atlantic world were joined. For Enwezor, then, Bowling's maps are a visual chronotope, as spatial effects of, quote, Reaperian turbulence and oceanic drama unfold thick time as an absorptive perceptual scene. These are not images of modernist universal transcendence, but a rhizomatic vision of constant motion, flows and eddies. As Dorothy Price made clear in a 2013 essay, the maps have now been understood as thoroughly non-synchronous, as works to be situated beyond what she terms the local context of Britain and British art. The paintings are instead read as a precursor of contemporary art's cultural preoccupation with the uneven territories of geopolitics, under the economic conditions of globalisation. In short then, contemporary art history has given us what we would call a postmodern bowling, one in which his paintings are emblematic, even symptomatic, of a globalised world crisscrossed by deterritorialised flows of culture, identity and subjectivity. Yet this process of presentist inscription has left the question of bowling's modernism begging, for he is an artist who has always been preoccupied with placing himself within a certain canon, a tradition which in true modernist fashion he equated with the movement of history itself. The map paintings were works honed in the milieu of Greenberg, Larry Rivers, Jules Zalitsky and Barnett Newman, and writing to Greenberg in March 73, Bowling would directly invoke Hegel, Marx, Toynbee, stating that I've been having another headlong rush at grappling with the indeed very slippery throat of history. What I want to do in this paper then is to try and recover something of the potency of Bowling's very particular relationship with modernism, a relationship in which the artist's dialogue with Turner and the wider English landscape tradition become a key interpretive tool. In September 1974, Bowling sent a remarkable postcard to Clement Greenberg, From Norwich to Norwich, in which he recounts wandering around the countryside in between looking at Cotman, Crome, Gainsborough, Stark, etc. And in Bowling's 2001 interview for the British Library's Artists' Lives project, Turner is always mentioned in relation to that very particular tradition. Complaining that people were trying to pin the tropical on me, Bowling states that I kept thinking that my work emerged from looking at English painting, Turner, Gainsborough, and you know, there's one particularly extraordinary artist, a Victorian, I think it was John, what's this fellow's name, Wilson? Rachel Scott, Frank's wife, quickly intervened to make clear that he was on about John Martin. Much later in the interview, a second reference to Turner comes in relation to Bowling's membership of the Royal Academy, in which the painter's pride at becoming the first black academician in 2005 is related, at least in part, to following in the footsteps of Gainsborough and Turner. Here then, Bowling seems to cut directly against Gilroy's reading of Turner. For the latter, Gilroy this is, a focus upon the slave ship is designed to strike against, quote, the place of Turner's art as an enduring expression of the very essence of English civilization. For Bowling, though, Turner's centrality to the canon was something to negotiate with, rather than reject outright. But critically, I want to emphasise that Bowling's turn to the legacy of Turner, English Romanticism, is not at odds with his modernism, but rather a particular refounding of the origins and capabilities of modern painting. Perhaps strangely, I'm reminded of a 1986 article on Georges Bataille by Rosalind Krauss, in which she expresses a deep disappointment in Bataille's rigidly formalist account of Manet, only to stumble upon what she terms another wholly alternate beginning in a brief passage on Goya's 3rd of May, a painting from which the blinding excess of violence erupts as the very image of death. Similarly then, I want to suggest that Bowling found his own alternate beginning for modern painting, one through which modernism would not be demolished wholesale, but rather revised, a sublime traumatic kernel understood to underpin formal revolution. It is sometimes tempting, perhaps, to see Turner in two modes, one preoccupied with the sublime of nature, the antiquity, the others with the fires of industry and the forces of history, say, Caligula's palace vis-a-vis rain, steam and speed. Bowling, though, always understood the two Turners to be inseparable, of nature itself to be dependent upon anthropocentric modernity. At the Royal College, he had written a thesis on Mondrian and Dutch landscape painting, informed by the pre-British colonial history of his native Guyana. And Bowling began to interrogate how the abstract spatial relations of modernism could themselves be dependent upon very real structures of capitalist commerce and colonisation. And of course, here it is impossible not to see a Turner connection via J.M.W's evident admiration for Van der Velde, Van Goyen, Kuyp or Hobbema. In short then, to read Bowling via Turner is to see that the dialectical progress of modernism was never self-contained, but rather moved in lockstep with the indeed very slippery throat of history itself. Bowling and Turner's joint dialogue, as we have just heard, began in earnest in 1966, a year in which both arrived in New York. Working from a Broadway studio, Bowling's work underwent immense changes, moving from pop-inflected images like CoverGirl, which was produced at the end of his first stint in London, through the much-discussed matte paintings, and towards the end of figurative reference altogether. His American evolution culminating in the likes of the very Rothko-esque Rupununi and the subsequent Pord paintings. However, Bowling's time in New York was also marked by the emergence of the Black Arts movement, an intense debate over the liberatory potential of art. In a series of essays written for Arts magazine between 1968 and 72, Bowling would skillfully advocate for the importance of abstraction in conjunction with the struggle for civil rights, and he has maintained that position ever since. To quote from an 1989 essay for Third Text, "Depiction of black faces and black hands does not make true black art. What does, though, lies in the formal expression by individual black artists of the black experience." I find the most telling exposition of such claims to be in an essay from autumn 1970, in which Bowling reflects on an essay on expression by Richard Volheim. In Bowling's reading of the text, the ability to express does not lie in a literal sense of intent, of painting a line to depict a black body. Rather, expression lies in the very form of a painting experience, one which, in his terms, imparts the subtlety of shared experience of every dweller in the black ghetto. Despite his proximity and extended correspondence with Greenberg, who was a figure, as Kelly Jones has aptly noted, never once wrote about or collected any of his work, Bowling's modernism was never one and the same with the arid, apolitical mainstream of 60s formalism. Instead, he understood that modernism's potential lay not in a set of purely aesthetic rules, but rather in an ability for form to respond dialectically to the world, rather than walling it off altogether. And I will suggest this was a lesson learnt, at least in part, from Turner. Now, whilst Bowling began to negotiate the New York art world, Lawrence Gowing's seminal exhibition, as we've just heard, Turner Imagination Reality, opened at MoMA. Unsurprisingly, the show would exercise none of Bowling's dialectical subtlety in its approach to modern painting. In his foreword to the catalogue, Munro Wheeler made clear that this would be a Turner show for a high modernist age, one focused upon late work, mostly unexhibited in the artist's lifetime. Supposedly, and this is a quote, "transcending the borderline between representation and abstraction, the section of the Turner corpus was directly linked to present-day abstract painters whose principal means of expression is light and colour." Lawrence Gowing's main text goes further still in its critical manipulations, as we find Turner's art deployed as the birth of medium specificity. Painting was now required to resemble itself before anything else, and as exemplary of what he calls the intrinsic visual character of painting. And tellingly, as you can see in this shot, the slave ship loaned from Boston and shown here was reproduced with a full-page plate in the catalogue, but scarcely discussed. Instead, it was given a very brief one-sentence treatment in which the power of the image was reduced to inward and symbolic affects, fantastic details, and flooding colour. In sum, then, when Gowing states at the start of the catalogue, "We cannot show the whole of Turner, it is not certain that we are yet prepared to see him whole," he inadvertently provided an apt summary of his own critical blindness. New York then provided a context which could only offer a limited reading of Turner and Bowling, their dialogue with modernism compressed into narrowly formalist terms. To recognise the more extensive terms of their discourse, we must return to London. In 1975, Bowling had moved back to England for familial reasons, living in Pimlico, where he still does, a matter of minutes from the Tate Gallery. In 1983, he would state that it's exciting and challenging to work in London, Turner's town, and the pressures of the weight of British tradition is exhilarating. Yet, to reiterate my earlier suggestion, this should not be seen as a regressive move, but rather one that was part and parcel of a continued dedication to an expansive, expressive modernism. In the late 80s, Bowling briefly worked from a studio on Cable Street in the East End, close to the Thames, and his series named after the great river, and you can see one of the four on the left here, inevitably calls up the atmospherics of both Turner and Constable. and Sasha Jason Guyana Dreams, which hopefully some of you have seen upstairs in the Turner Gallery, was inspired by a trip with Sasha, his second son, to the land of his birth and youth. And yet its surface and colours recall a vaporised rainbow, equally akin to the atmospherics of Constable's Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows or Turner's Norham Castle. The point, however, is not to pin a nationality on Bowling's art. Instead, it is a matter of understanding how the English landscape tradition could help transfigure the relationship between colonial modernity and the natural world into painterly effect. I want to return to Entangled Past to locate a particular intersection between Bowling and Turner that points directly to the historical stakes of their modern painting. There, hanging in the same gallery as Middle Passage, was Turner's Whalers, first exhibited at the RA in 1845 and now in the collection of the Met in New York. Mentioned in the curator's wall text was Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and as Sam Smiles has very convincingly showed, Turner's group of 4 whaling pictures clearly had a strong bearing on that novel. Smiles points to a wonderful passage in Moby Dick in which Ishmael describes a boggy, soggy, squitchy picture of a whale hunt, one that puzzled and confounded with the Leviathan, a long, limber, portentous black mass of something hovering in the centre. The parallels with the New York painting are striking, and as is Melville's summary of the indefinite, half-attained, unimaginable sublimity that fairly throws you to it. Now, Melville provides a crucial interpretive node for revealing the stakes behind Turner's paintings, but Melville also leads us directly to Bowling. For, in 1981, the painter produced an immense canvas entitled Moby Dick. And as with most of his work, the painting was created on the horizontal of the floor. Bowling covered the raw canvas with washers of acrylic and turpentine. We can even make out the round zits marks left by Bowling's buckets, ghostly circles within the great flows of paint. To this, flecks and splodges of thicker near impasto, yellow, blue and pink have been added, cascading downwards as if subject to an alternate gravity to the layering of washers. The result is a series of oceanic blooms, none of which are orientated in any such way as to give the viewer a stable hold on the painting. Instead, we are plunged into a vertiginous dislocation of the vertical gestalt, one both dizzying and sublime. Placed side by side with Whalers, it is hard not to equate the ink-like cloud at the right of Bowling's painting with Turner's deployment of a black scotomer to demarcate the wounded whale. However, such figurative evocations should be resisted. Instead, it is the enveloping phenomenology of both works that proves vital, recalling Melville's description of the transformative near-drowning of the cabin boy Pip. Carried down to wondrous depths, where strange shapes of the unwarped primal world glided to and fro before his passive eyes, Pip saw the multitudinous, God-omnipresent coral insects that out of the firmament of waters heave the colossal orbs. James Hamilton has detailed how the mixed historical reaction to Turner's Whalers was conditioned by its blinding whiteness. The Times described the canvas as one mass of white spray, which so blends with the white clouds of the sky that the spectator can hardly separate them. Inevitably, such words recall Melville's chapter on the whiteness of his titular whale, a visible absence of colour, at once the most meaning symbol of spiritual things, nay, the very veil of the Christian's deity, but also an utterly terrifying quality that thus stabs us from behind with the thought of annihilation. Writing on Bowling's own series of white paintings, Indy Chowdhury has spoken of the painter's creolization of the white monochrome, one which destabilizes its claim as the ultimate tabula rasa and point of origin, instead positing colour as a means for innate fluidity and destabilization. But reading Bowling's Moby Dick via Turner and Melville, I want to suggest that it's perhaps less a matter of what Bowling does to whiteness and more a matter of what whiteness does to us. Following Toni Morrison, it's now a well-accepted critical move to directly equate Melville's notion of whiteness with a contemporary understanding of white supremacy. Such an equation, perhaps strangely, originates in an essay by D.H. Lawrence, in which he summarises the infernal chase for Moby Dick as a consequence of the maniacal fanaticism of a white mental consciousness, the deepest blood being of the white race, one which would doom all. Yet whereas Lawrence's language posed the problematic in racial terms, C.L.R. James was surely correct to posit that the maniacal fanaticism at the heart of Moby Dick is capitalism itself. As he stated, the Pequod is the environment of an industry, of men doing the daily business of the modern world. And likewise, in Turner's whaling pictures, I think of whalers boiling blubber, which is on show upstairs, I forgot to include a picture of. And in that image, like the engine's firebox in Rain, Steam and Speed, the inferno which boils the blubber under the ship's deck quite literally blazes through the hull of the ship, smoke billowing overhead. And in the New York picture, industry is undergirded by the very violence of the hunt, red gore spouting from the whale's blowhole as the entire sea becomes convulsed with the creature's wrath. Now, there are, of course, no such explicit vignettes in Bowling's painting, but the absence of figurative reference does not serve to drive his work back into the fold of a narrow formalism. Interviewed in connection with Tate's Turner and Constable show, Bowling would explain his continued fascination with Turner thus. Up close, you can see the brush marks, that he was pulling and dragging the paint to perform, physically engaging with it. The turmoil of beaten up paint and colour is what I'm after in my own paintings as well. His paintings come across as felt. His work went through his whole body. What is so striking here is Bowling's vivid perception of the bodily sensations conjured by his predecessor's work, qualities that recall his New York era criticism in which form itself becomes the means to express. And similarly, what confounded those early critics of Turner's whaling pictures was not their content, but their blinding, disorienting deployment of form, as paint itself came to embody the tumultuous violence of Turner's subject matter. Gazing into the depths of Moby Dick, we are plunged into a tumultuous sublime that binds modern painting with the experience of modernity itself. For Frank Bowling, this is Turner's enduring lesson. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Again, a fascinating dive into a kind of creative archive, and a particularly kind of deep and archive of real duration there. Moving on next, our third paper before we take a short break is from Tate Brock. Kate is a PhD researcher at the Royal College of Art, a painter, curator and critic, and holds an MFA from the art writing program at the School of Visual Arts, New York. And Kate is going to be talking about Turner and Sheila Fell. So if you could welcome Kate to the stand.
I'm not a curator yet, but maybe at the end of this conversation, I don't know how that worked its way into my bio. I want to thank the organizers of this conference, as well as the many workers who have facilitated it, and highlight the advocacy of PCS Tate United, who earlier this week were striking for livable wages for all people that work at the Tate. This talk considers a seam of cross-historical haunting between the ecological agent of the Solway Firth, Turner, and Sheila Fell, the 20th century Cumbrian artist. I'm in here too as an American painter from Southwest Pennsylvania, which is a landscape that shares many sort of geological and labor histories with Solway, with Northern England, and with parts of Scotland. So my approach, in full disclosure, is informed by art history, but is sort of a Ruskin-esque recollection, ekphrasis, critical interpretation, sort of inspired by Ruskin's memoir writing, in which he actually calls Solway and its sands his, quote, greatest teacher. So here you see Sheila Fell painting and sketching in Allenby, which is a place that you'll sort of hear me reference quite a lot in this talk. And the photo in the back is of Allenby as it is now, so more or less keeping us deeply rooted to the place. God, the scary clicker. Woo! Okay. So I'm going to start us off just before Turner, actually, in 1771, when a tremendous natural event occurred, the eruption of the Solway moss, quote, a prodigious mass, which I love as a phrase. So there was a period of extreme, almost biblical rainfall in northern Cumbria, and the skin of the moss swelled until it breached the peat bog, spewing itself over 800 acres of farmland and villages. It was a catastrophe. And this rapid effacement of the kind of known topography of the area produced a lot of firsthand sort of reporting as well as travel writing about, in which we see the formation of the Romantic consciousness towards the sublime happening in this really quite physically muddy, murky, real-life kind of experience. And so contemporary environmental archaeology of this very moss, this peat bog, which is from Turner's Liber Studiorum, the contemporary studies are looking at the cores of peat, which actually go back 9,000 years, and through studies of spore and pollen can kind of tell a narration of Solway, which enfolds the Anthropocene all the way up through the Romans, through the Romantics, through industrial agriculture, extraction, and into the present, into now. So for the purposes of my research, the bog and its flow kind of form these living assemblages of material, both manipulated by, informing, and altering human activity in the landscape. So this takes us to this fantastic creature, the compass jellyfish, which washed up on the beach while I was there for a few short days in Allenby. And although it's native to North Atlantic waters, its population is rapidly increasing due to climate change-induced warming. What this photo doesn't show is that a few meters away, a rotting seal carcass has washed up on the shore, its death more than likely caused by human intervention. And I'm looking at its remains and its mottled fur and thinking about the part of the landscape I cannot see, which is in the water, where in the 1980s, the Ministry of Defense fired 30 tons of uranium explosives, essentially nuclear waste, off the coast of Kirkcudbright. And so I'm sort of like looking at this seal, which is a picture that I didn't want to show you, and thinking about the kinds of layering that are happening in the terrain. Later on, I found this incredibly beautiful bit of word painting by Constable, which I'm just going to read for us. The moon shone broad and bright upon the placid face of the Solway and showed a slight ripple upon the stakes, the tops of which were just visible above the waves on the dark-colored buoys which marked the upper edge of the enclosure of nets. At a much greater distance, the line of the English coast was seen on the verge of the water, resembling one of those fog banks on which mariners are said to gaze, uncertain whether it be land or atmospherical delusion. I quite like the idea of England as atmospheric delusion, which feels like an honest descriptor for an island that is a slippery amalgamation of identities, histories, and borders that evolve out of this very myth of Romanticism. The romantic landscape is such a big part of that. So between where Constable and Turner and Fell stood and where I am standing looking at this jellyfish is this sea that would have more or less looked the same to them as it does to me. And yet the history of industrialization, militarization, the kind of abandonment of the North, which happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, are kind of all oscillating for me in that moment. So, God, the clicker is really oppressive. Okay, so this takes us to this painting, which is weird. I just learned about it. We saw it earlier in the presentation on Rothko as well. Turner's 3 seascapes. He painted sometimes multiple paintings on a single roll of canvas. This one exists unseparated. And I want to read it in a slightly ahistorical manner, which is to think about the layering of landscape, this sort of strata, as an instructive image for thinking about place in the Solway now. So we have essentially two seascapes and a third, which is in reverse. So you have the ground above, and they're sharing a sky, which I think is just a beautiful sort of poetic metaphor for where we're going to go next. Hold on to your seats. Okay. Which takes us to Sheila Fell. So Fell was born in 1931 to a working class coal mining family in Espatria, which is very, very close to where we see her painting in that first photo in Allenby. She moved to London, but remained deeply involved with the landscapes of her birth throughout her whole life. And she was a prominent figure. She was working alongside Frank Auerbach, Leon Kossoff, Prunella Cloth, many others, in the kind of kitchen sink post-war scene. But her life was marked by a compartmentalization and a kind of struggle between her life in Cumbria and the conservative, that kind of world, intact world, and then her freewheeling life in London. So I've chosen this painting not because it's not a seascape, and it actually is a little bit more representative of the kind of paintings Fell made of Cumbrian farm fields, which to me has this incredible subterranean sense. So if we're thinking of Turner as atmosphere, I'd like to sort of think of Fell as ground and underground even. I kind of attribute this to her proximity to mining. Her father was a coal miner, and her relationship with mining is just shot through every aspect of her work. Here is one of Turner's really scant little sketches looking across the Solway. Here is that same place now, but the tide is out. It's a little bit of writing. I'm sitting on the beach at Allenby at the tidal borderlands of northern England. Across the shore of the Firth is the edge of Dumfries and Galloway. Somewhere beyond is a horizon I cannot see, the shores of Northern Ireland. I'm aware that this location is listed for its outstanding natural beauty, and it is that. The weather has passed through every season today: dramatic rain, sun, winds, fleshy clouds that form and spill out of the ether. The beach is spotted with strange industrial remnants, and I walk among their silver bodies hovering in an indiscernible distance. I see almost no one else, 1 to 2 fishermen who have waded far out into the low tides. One tells me that on some days you can walk across the Firth to Scotland. Contemporary Allenby is a sleepy fishing village on the periphery of more frequented resort places like Silloth, and it's haunted by histories that implicate more or less the entire world. Solway has been a place of dramatic change on a global scale, kind of from the beginning of time, human time, and before that. I returned to the only shop in the village, which is a waterlogged general store, and buy several flavors of novelty fudge. The Solway was, for Ruskin, Turner, Constable, this quintessential image of the romantic landscape, and here am I in it, strange kind of outsider, and I mostly feel Fell here. I feel the desolation of this place, I feel the workers in this place, and the kind of brutality of living in a climate which is rapidly changing. This is one of Fell's paintings of the high tides at Allenby, which are terrifying, by the way. Although she was successful and one of the few women inducted into the Royal Academy at the time when she was living, and she exhibited and sold a lot of work in her unfortunately short life, Fell faced gendered and class barriers that were substantial in comparison with her peers. And it's my feeling that this had an enormous impact on the direction and aesthetic of her work, which was largely anachronistic. It was looking towards the past. She was much more focused on conversations with artists like Soutine, Permecki, Claude, Constable, and of course, Turner. On December 15th, 1979, she suffered a fatal fall down the steep stairs of her London apartment after a bout of heavy drinking. She had been busy preparing for the opening of her solo show at New Grafton. Her death was untimely. She was 48, coming into the peak of her career, And it also meant that for decades, her work was relatively unknown. And in fact, it is only this year that a catalog of her oil paintings has been published after a long overdue retrospective at Tully Museum in Carlisle in 2024. Fell's relationship with British Romanticism was particular to her in that it inhabited these places which Turner and Constable and others visited with a kind of informed voyeurism. For Fell, it was her home. And so the seas and the mines and the people that were working in them were of her. And I think that that is a kind of constitutive, generative approach to Romanticism that I find kind of continually inspiring. So you have like Auerbach and Kossoff, and these big guys going to the National Gallery and sketching the greats, which Fell was doing too, but even though it was sort of like the signifiers are the same, the act feels so different in her paintings to me. I think she was looking for a very direct and personal language to share Cumbria. And there's this beautiful quote that she has where she says, "I hope that the nearby community is always implicit in my landscapes." And maybe I can talk more about that later, about how the retrospective really felt that way to me. So we have Turner and Fell, where she's sort of directly quoting. She's like, yeah, I'll give you a great. And by the way, I'm there too. And I want to think about painterly influence in their relationship as kind of a two-way street. I know that that's hard to imagine, but I think that Fell can illuminate how we think of Turner just as much as Turner illuminates how Fell is approaching painting and the Romantic tradition. I want to bring up a quote from Emerson on landscape where he says, "For you cannot freely admire a noble landscape if laborers are digging in the field hard by," which is from Nature, his essay on nature. And I think in Fell, we don't have to compromise between, I mean, in Turner to some extent as well, we don't have to compromise between thinking about the people that are working the land itself, its beauty, its sublimity, its terror, just in keeping with some of the amazing conversations we've had today around that topic. So in reading the Firth through its contemporary appearance, Fell's post-war experience, and Turner's romantic sensibility, we get sort of a composite image of place and painting in which the topographies of deep time presence in our now. You can sort of see this in one of my favorite paintings by Fell. It's just so lush of potato. Her potato field paintings are worthy of another lecture indeed. So to conclude, I'd like to leave us with this somewhat provocative quote, which is actually, those of you who are followers of performance art may know, is a sort of re-quotation of Carolee Schneemann, the great American painter and performer, who had an artist book in 1973 called Cézanne, She Was a Great Painter. And this act, I think, basically sums up kind of what Fell was doing. And she's a tricky figure for me in a lot of ways because she doesn't give it to you in language that would have been sort of in keeping with the 70s feminist movements. But for me and my painting, I'd like to use kind of Fell's vision and relationship with the greats, which was deeply irreverent, actually, to paint a Turner almost verbatim in the way that she did. So I'm thinking of Turner's legacy in this sort of eco-feminist inhabitation that's probably very American as well, I'm realizing. And I want to consider like the gift of Fell's work as a recentering of a sort of rigorous art historical reckoning within the erotics of a rural feminist landscape. And I'll leave you with this final quote from her, which is said that a painter can be rooted in his dream, but lean out of it toward reality. Sorry, I just got so moved thinking about her. And so that's kind of my dream, is that Fell's dream becomes one in which Turner and she sort of can see each other, basically. So thank you.
Well, fantastic, powerful stuff there. Thank you so much, Kate. And yeah, the all suggestion, provocation there of thinking about a kind of a dialogue and a kind of two-way passage between the past and the present. Maybe it's something we'll pick up on in the Q&A. And it was my horrible handwriting that blurred this distinction between writer and curator. So I apologise for that. But maybe that's, I don't know, maybe there's something in that. I don't know. But there are full bios of all our speakers across the 2 days available online. Let's continue this afternoon's session, panel 5, Artistic Legacies. And I will be welcoming out now Sabo Kpade, who's a writer and curator and researcher based in the UK, who specialises in contemporary art and culture from Africa and its diaspora. He brings an interdisciplinary perspective to the practice of art history, holding MAs from the Rhode Island School of Design and the University of East Anglia. And he's talking this afternoon on Turner and John Akomfrah. So welcome, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My paper explores how Sir John Akomfrah inherits and transforms J.M.W. Turner's maritime sublime, turning the sea from a site of spectacle into what Akomfrah calls, quote, a reservoir of recollection, unquote. I wasn't sure how to use this clicker, so if I get it wrong, don't worry, you've done your job. So I am discussing two oceans that are 175 years apart. They both have the same swirling composition. Both have entirely different meanings. Everything I will say is contained in this visual dialogue between Turner's slave ship and Akomfrah's Vertigo Sea. Beginning with Turner and the historical event that is submerged beneath his painting. We've seen this painting discussed here today, and I'm going to try to take hopefully an original take on the work. Let's see if that works. So pretending no one here has heard of the slave ship, Turner's painting. In 1781, the British-owned Zong, sailing from West Africa towards Jamaica, entered stormy waters and increasingly clouded conditions. Over the course of several weeks, the crew and captain made a series of decisions that would become known as the Zong Massacre, seeking to profit from an insurance policy that covered enslaved Africans only if they died by drowning, and not from disease or other causes. They chose to treat the people on board as cargo rather than human beings. Crucially, this was not a single moment of violence, but a sequence of deliberate killings carried out over several days, a fact later confirmed in the 1783 court case, Gregson versus Gilbert. The decision unfolded in stages. First, 54 women and children were thrown overboard. A few days later, 42 men, then a further 26. Contemporary accounts also record that 10 people jumped into the water themselves. The sick were often selected first. What becomes clear is that the massacre was not the result of a sudden crisis, but a series of calculated acts shaped by maritime insurance logic. Each decision reinforcing the violent fiction that Africans on board were property whose destruction could yield financial profit. I came up with something I'm calling Turner's double death. But to explain it, I'll start with the highest praise that he's ever received, especially the work, The Slave Ship from 1840, written by Ruskin in the book that has been mentioned by several other speakers, Modern Painters. Quoting Ruskin. Here he builds Turner's immortality, more or less. Quote, "If I were to reduce to rest Turner's immortality upon any single work, I should choose this. Its daring conception, is based upon the purest truth, roughed out with the concentrated knowledge of a life. The whole surface of the sea, like the lifting of its bosom by deep drawn breath after the torture of a storm. If anyone has reading that text, and I haven't read too much of Ruskin, what he does there is what I later describe as affective proximity, where you're describing it, and in the prose itself, you feel the swelling of the sea. It's quite impressive. I wish I wrote it myself. And just how when he says a deep drawn breath, how the farthest away body like water, the faraway ocean is made to be immediate, like the deep drawn breath. So it's, if you had to just read it, if you just do a prosody check of the text, it's him describing it's actually, mess is a good word for it, but he comes across in the writing. I'll go on. This is Turner now, Ruskin. The intense and lurid splendor which burns like gold and bathes like blood. This is continuing from the previous sentence, which goes, the whole surface of the sea, like the lifting of his bosom by deep drawn breath after the torture of the storm. And then he goes on and builds it and says, the intense and lurid splendor that burns like gold and bathes like blood. What's his verdict now on Turner? He says, quote, the whole picture dedicated to the power, majesty, and depthfulness of the open, deep, illimitable sea. Depthfulness, that's the last sentence in the text. Not the deaths themselves, not the died, the dead, not the 133 people, only the oceanic majesty. What's the problem here? That beauty is either built or supposedly built on black death. What is not described in the paintings, what Ruskin does not describe, but it's it's been studied extensively since, is what happens at the lower bottom of the painting. I'll try doing this. Where you don't see this at first looking at the painting, and people have studied this, I know I'm in a room full of very intelligent people, but you don't see the gruesomeness at the bottom end when you're looking at this painting. Your eyes are directed towards the light first, you see the painting. The logic goes this way, and then later on, much later, before you don't see this until much later, what's going on here, hands shackled, drowned, limb sticking out, but then here, at the bottom right, at the bottom right, you see two sharks here, possibly sharks, mouth of the gate, approaching. Well, you don't see that at first. It took me a while to even see that, looking at the painting, even preparing for the talk. Focusing on this painting alone, you would say he deprioritized Black Death. But if you were to look up, and I spent some time going over to see the painting, the Turner and Constable exhibition with Nick McCaw, you see that it's just what he does. And I just earlier getting lunch with a few people. I was asked if they're in the room there because going around the exhibition, I took photos of most of his paintings that the bottom right, bottom left of the painting, just a section. In most of his paintings there, a lot of them. There seems to be a lot going on in this section. I don't know quite yet what it is. I will say after this talk, but that's where his portion is. He's located Black Death. Now, if I don't know his work extensively, I would say he just prioritized the brown bodies of black bodies. It turns out it's part of visual logic. For the most part of his paintings, someone else here can explain that to me maybe later, or I'll go read up on it. What I'm saying here is that Turner stages violence across time. What has happened, bodies thrown into the water. What is happening, they're being fed on by fishes. And what is coming, the sharks. So 3 levels of violence here going on in just the one painting alone. But focusing on technique alone, What does he do? First, he uses dissolution, where body and water are made indistinguishable. Second, there's a chromatic violence there, on a chromatic hierarchy, where blood and sunset become one continuous red. Excuse me. Color unifies the sublime rather than marking the horror, or at least prioritizing the horror. Third is fragmentation. You don't see any faces, no identities, no struggle, even if drowning, only parts. Turner gives just enough detail for us to register the violence, then processes it through such painterly brilliance that the horror becomes aesthetically consumable, not in the argument. Was part of my argument here. All readings are possible, none centers the human cost. And I mentioned the visual hierarchy, where it would seem that it's going from the brightest gold to bright gold, then there's a red here, then murky brown, so it's like there's a visual hierarchy there. I think that's going on. What is at the bottom of that hierarchy? Black Death. The eye is pulled downwards by the light. By the time you reach the drowning, you have already been seduced by the beauty above. The horror arrives after the aesthetic pleasure. That timing is not accidental. In isolation, the violence is unavoidable. In context, it is absorbed, incidental to the painting's own splendor. And that is what I call double death. The physical, the physical dead, 132 people drowned, but then the representational death, where you don't see the faces, you don't see the struggle, you don't see any agency, just the drowned. And if people remember this scene from the Mike Lee film, Turner, Timothy Spall goes to this couple's house to lodge, and then he gets into a brief conversation with the couple, or at least the husband. He asked the husband what he did. He told him, I was a sheep's carpenter. He goes, spices, whalers. The carpenter goes to him, no, slavers. What comes next is weighted silence. And the way it's rendered in the film, it's Timothy Spall doing Timothy Spall grunt, and then weighted silence. It's done very well. But again, it echoes the problem with representation, where you know these people mean well, but the story again is relegated to just grunts, gaps. It's not sufficient. And that's the distinction. So what my point there is that, taken literally, the drowned are sonically erased. Ruskin performs a partial wake, a wake for genius, not for the dead. Turner keeps a wake. He marks the atrocity. He does not defend the dead. And that distinction between keeping a wake and practicing wake work is precisely where I am introducing John Akomfrah's work. To do this, I am relying on a few theoretical concepts, which, if you know, coming from someone who started trying to be, coming from a failed novelist and a magazine writer, to now only rely on theories is completely a complete turn for me. Ed Kettleborough mentioned Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic. If you're writing in this space, you can't escape that's a very big work. And what does Paul Gilroy say? Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic describes the transatlantic world created by the Middle Passage, where Black identity forms through routes, not roots, not fixed origins, but oceanic displacement as the condition of Black modernity. This is Gilroy now. He says the Atlantic is a space producing new identities, memories, and cultural forms, a counterculture of modernity formed through oceanic displacement. This means, I don't mean to torture you with this picture, I really wanted to move quickly. The Atlantic is the space producing new identities, memories, and cultural forms, a counterculture of modernity formed through oceanic displacement. Unquote. This means Turner's painting is not an isolated aesthetic object. It belongs to the economic, racial, and cultural systems that shape modernity itself. The Zong was not an aberration, it was capital, insurance law, maritime logistics. Turner paints the Atlantic as sublime nature. Gilroy shows it as a system, as machine, as origin site of modernity. Turner shows the ship's wake. Gilroy shows the cultural wake. Gilroy aside, Christina Sharp is her notion of wake work is one I rely on. And basically what she's saying is wake work is, the concept of wake work names the ongoing labor of living in slavery's afterlife. Wake has two meanings. First, the track a ship leaves behind, turbulence that lingers. Second, the vigil for the dead, mourning, ceremony, protection. Sharp writes, to live in the wake is to live in slavery's ongoing consequences, to inhabit the space of historical violence that persists in the present, unquote. I couldn't fit in all the quotes I wanted, so I put some over there and then I'll read out some, but very briefly. Black life unfolds in both wakes at once, in turbulence and in ceremony. The lowest stratum in Turner's painting, the drowning occupying barely 15% of the canvas, is for Sharp precisely where black life and black study occur, in the wake. She invokes a phrase by Marlene Phillips, the poet, Canadian poet, which I said earlier, which is defend the dead, defend the dead, defend the dead. I'm putting that refrain in there. It was just a sentence or a phrase. Not merely remember them, defend them. Sharp aside, Akomfrah himself has spoken about this in a 2016 interview. When asked whether he had ethical concerns about using images of human suffering, he said, quote, to simply show suffering as spectacle, as something you can consume from a safe distance, is to participate in a certain kind of pornography of dehumanization, unquote. Interestingly, even he is accused of some of this in his own work. So it's not just Turner who gets any rap. It is difficult to think of a sharper critique of the Sublime. These three aside, Saidiya Hartman's notion of critical fabulation mentioned in Nick Makoha's talk, it's quite an important concept that people now use when it comes. Critical fabulation is what it's called. Basically, what she does is just take historical accounts, the gaps in the archive. She fills them up with. The idea is to fill it up with historical accounts, reconstruction. In Akomfrah's work, he uses figurative tableau. So it's a reconstruction, really. It's what critical fabulation is. Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation refuses the archive's silence. The enslaved appear as cargo, not persons. Their interiority was never recorded. Hartman seeks, in her words, quote, to paint as full a picture of the lives of the captives as possible, unquote. What does critical fabulation look like in John Akomfrah's work? If anyone has seen this or on his other films, this is a character dressed as what you imagine a gentleman's outfit. And that's him holding the clock. And anyone who hasn't seen this when in a gallery space, usually the huge screens, they consume you, you don't consume it in a way. So it looks a lot more impressive than what it looks like here. In Vertigo C, he's got this character as Equiano, but this is borrowed from Caspar von Friedrich. Yes, you recognize that from his painting. So it's the idea of the timekeeper, the man as witness. I mentioned that just to say that even though Akomfrah hasn't himself, I know from the gallery, from people I've spoken to at the gallery, he is interested in critical fabulation, but this has been going on in his work from time. Peripetetia looks at Peripetetia, what year now? I'll try to remember and share it. Looks at Dürer's work, and then the black characters in Dürer's work about whom we know nothing. He now creates a whole critical fabulation type thing where he reconstructs their lives and then presents them as, say, people living in contemporary landscape. So it's something he does in his work repeatedly, which thankfully he actually quotes Saidiya Hartman as an inspiration for this. Moving on to Akomfrah and the notion of affective proximity. I mentioned his film Vertigo C is a 48-minute film, three-screen installation that asks one question above all: what if water had memory? What would it tell us about 500 years of violence, migration, and survival? I know from interviews that he was influenced by the Memory of Water debate from 1988. Bevanist, his name is, and the whole notion about water having actual memory. It was completely debunked by the Nature magazine. It was published there, but Akomfrah decides to take this as poetic fact rather than scientific fact. But what if water had memory all these years? What would it tell you today about all that's gone into it? Akomfrah's method is what he calls affective proximity, a concept he expands in his dialogue with Eko Oshun and author Jafar in a book coming out next year. The gallery has been very nice to share an excerpt from the book with me, as well as share all his films with me, and I'll quote from it very briefly. This is Akomfrah. He says, "The desire to build a series of concentric circles around objects that create contact zones between them, to open oneself to vibes," his word, "that appear on the surface to be different or unique, but on closer inspection begin to suggest affinities one had not noticed before," unquote. And then the crucial line from him, he says, "For us, artists of color, especially of African origins, this is a major point to arrive at." He also says in a 2019 interview, there is, quote, "There is always a space between the ethics by which one works and the aesthetic one wants to work towards. There's always a gap." I'm not sure if he knows this, but that definition there, the gap between the aesthetic and the ethical and the aesthetic, is what Alfred Gell describes as the very definition of what art is. And if you know, follow Alfred Gell, English anthropologist, everybody has their definition of what art is. His I find the most satisfying, and it basically just says that the gap between the intention of the artist and the uncertainty they overcome trying to produce the work is what magic is. And that's where he locates the definition of art and no further. And I find that to be quite satisfying. And this is what Akomfrah is describing, even without even evoking Gell's name. The gap is the work I mentioned, and it is exactly what this triptych I will show next. This is somewhere into Vertigo C, maybe 14 minutes into the near 15-minute film, and watching it, I'll quickly go to my next slide, even if I wasn't ready for it, to see where the idea came from. So watching these two films, please try to ignore the text here. I'm switching my mind about what I could be here. I couldn't change the slide, but you've got the birds here, you've got bird time, you've got the birds here, you've got the humans, even though they are still from the film, and there is some struggle there, but they've been through the war. And then there's the ocean, the ocean. So both working with the same elements: bird time, human time, oceanic time, geological time. And these are just, and yes, Akomfrah talks about his love for Turner. It's on record. He said there many different times. But these are just affinities that emerge in the work, even without one being the source of the other. And you might miss this in the actual film itself. But going back to this very briefly. 3 temporalities at once: bird time, human time, oceanic time I mentioned. Meaning does not arrive through tidy synthesis. It emerges in the restlessness of your eye moving across the screens, in what Akomfrah calls the contact zone. Turner tries to close the gap with the sublime. Akomfrah, you would argue, in 2025, he's had the advantage of 200 years. Akomfrah keeps us inside it. Where Turner dissolves black bodies into catastrophe, Akomfrah sustains the contact zone, refusing the safe distance that would make suffering consumable. But this method has its own risks. Reviews from The Guardian, from Art Review, and from the journal Parallax all note the same tension. Akomfrah's work is not immune to the seductions of beauty. The Oceanic Sublime is in vertigo sea, can threaten to overwhelm the ethical weight of its histories. And I wish I can take a poll on who has seen any of the Akomfrah's films. You would, and I can't play you a clip. It does look seductive in parts and would seem to, someone earlier mentioned the feedback mechanism was that you try to solve a problem, by solving the problem, you introduce new irregularities. And I think that's happening, that might be happening in some of Akomfrah's work, or at least that's what the critics are arguing. And I'll quote them some very briefly. These affinities are not imposed by curating. That's the affinities between, oh no, ahead of myself. Yeah. Very briefly about the critics and what they observed. One critic goes, the ravishing imagery risks aestheticizing the very violence it seeks to expose. That's from The Guardian. In the art review, the reviewer goes, the philosophical grandeur of the seascapes verges at moments on the spectacle it critiques. And then from Parallax, the journal Parallax, the writer goes, Akomfrah's ocean becomes a site of terror and beauty, where the sublime threatens to absorb the historical trauma it frames. His own work, even as a corrective measure, does risk repeating the same problem, if not done carefully. So I'm guessing the sublime is that seductive. Is maybe the point there. I'll go on. Even work committed to mourning and memory can slip momentarily into spectacle. The danger is real. The sublime can absorb the suffering it seeks to reveal. And it is this ethical volatility that makes the pairing with Turner so powerful. Rather than setting them in confrontation, an exhibition between the two of them, of their works, Turner and Akomfrah, is likely to put them in concert. Two artists working with the same volatile materials: water, memory, erasure, the archive, the sublime. This is a bit gruesome, but it's in Akomfrah's film. And right where this scene and this scene is, there's a voiceover, and that's from an excerpt from John Newton. But I'll skip that. My man over there is being very polite, and thank you. No, before you congratulate me on nothing, hold on. Hold on, please. This is the big gambit I'm trying to introduce. Both artists in concert. An exhibition of both of their works. Starting, hopefully, if ever this ever happens. In my mind, I like to play the exhibition fantasy. Yes. The hope is that if this ever happens, that you come into an exhibition room where first you get the two artists in concert station. Vertical sea. There's a second room, it focuses on Turner and sea, or maybe on Turner and death, on the death. There will be a way to choose it, but then it has to be thematically related to what to the sublime catastrophe, American violence, and absence of PVC. Then the third room, hopefully, is what, in my mind, Akomfrah and sea, we focus on Akomfrah as well and sea. And lastly, if possible, I would like the idea is that Akomfrah investigates Turner, or responds to Turner in his own way, or responds to just the slave ship alone. The idea is that you have Britain's most consequential painter, that's established. Akomfrah is in his 60s, represented Britain at the Venice Biennale in 2024, probably one of the most prominent and respected artists in the country. It could make for a beneficial conversation to ever bring the two of them together in concert. And that is it. Thank you for being nice.
Great, thank you. Adding to this kind of rich tapestry, I get a sense of, even if we're circling around the same pictures often, there's kind of fresh things to think about with each paper. Okay, so now the final panelist, Julia DeFabo, who is curator and creative producer, currently arts officer, exhibitions and collections at Orleans House Gallery, and who works with a focus on cross-cultural exchange and decolonisation, and talking today about Libby Heaney at Orleans House Gallery. So, straight on to you, Julia.
Thank you, everyone, for sticking around to the end of the day on the Friday. I appreciate that. So thank you to the organizers, Tate and Paul Mellon Center, and also to the Turner Society for supporting this paper. I'm the lead producer on Shadowscapes, Heaney, J.M.W, Turner, and Quantum, which is on view at Orleans House Gallery until the 1st of March, so you still have time to see it. The exhibition features newly commissioned work by contemporary artist Libby Heaney, alongside 3 Turner paintings on loan from Tate. This is a personal and deeply self-reflective exhibition for Heaney, in which she weaves together Turner and theories from psychotherapist Carl Jung to explore her shadow self. That's the part of ourselves that we deem unacceptable and therefore unconsciously suppress. So what can we find in Turner's shadows? What makes Turner's paintings so endlessly fascinating to so many of us is his use of light and dark. In Shadowscapes, Heaney looks to Turner's use of light and dark as psychological metaphors for her own emotions. She encourages us to reassess Turner's use of light and dark to uncover our personal and societal shadow selves. In the exhibition, Turner's paintings are treated as living beings. I kind of think about how artworks are treated as characters in Scottish novelist Ali Smith's novels. That's kind of how they're being treated here, as almost as people. So in approaching art this way, we find that artworks, like humans, are multifaceted and always changing. So just as Deleuze tells us that we're ceaselessly in a process of becoming, never just one thing or another, the exhibition shows us that artwork too is constantly in a state of becoming. What is significant to Heaney's approach is that this isn't just a reinterpretation of the artwork. She is revealing to us that artworks become something completely different through different times, different spaces, and different individuals' experiences with them. I'm reminded of the 1986 volume, The Social Life of Things, which explores how things, so commodities and different objects, gain social relationships through human interaction and cultural context. In Shadowscapes, Heaney brings forth a new social relationship for us and for visitors to experience with Turner's paintings. Heaney trained as a quantum physicist, and while her work is not about quantum, she uses quantum concepts and materiality. Viewed through a quantum lens, where our concept of time is layered and compressed, and in some senses loses meaning, our social relationships that we've societally built with Turner over the past 200 plus years become layered and compressed as well. This is in keeping with the broad post-structuralist perspective of the social life of things, in which nothing has a fixed meaning, and which rejects false binaries, very quantum. So how does Heaney approach Turner's paintings? Turner's paintings are a portal. This is how she puts it. And before we're tempted to go too far with the quantum metaphor and think that maybe she's talking about time travel here, she isn't. She's talking about something very relatable to us non-scientists, emotions. She describes her process of working with the 3 paintings in the exhibition, seeing them as tunnels and portals, which allow her to access her own hidden depths. Her process involved observing each of the paintings closely, channeling these observations through journaling, writing, sketching, painting, embodied movement, and AI. With this process, Heaney expanded on both the content and the form of Turner's depictions. Of course, none of these extensions are a pure binary of expanding either on content or expanding on form. They're both at the same time, entwined and working together, even while at odds with each other, a quantum way of being. Emotive content allows us to see forms in a different way, and form allows us to feel and be in touch with our emotions in a different way. So first, expanding on Turner's content. For each of her watercolor works in the exhibition, Heaney wrote text on the back of the painting while in this process of closely observing Turner's work. That text is now hidden, so we don't get to know what it says, though we do know that the text informed the content of Heaney's paintings themselves. So how she exactly expands on Turner's content remains close to her, as emotions often do. Turner's painting acted as she puts it, catalyst to explore hidden depths and emotions. So this is now an opportunity to point out that our hidden depths and emotions aren't always negative ones. In placing this work within the context of Jung's concept of the shadow self, Heaney includes the concept of the golden shadow, the repressed positive parts of ourselves. She painted this watercolor, Golden Shadow Hips, after a day of dancing at the venue Fold here in London. The forms draw on the mushy, inexact faces in Turner's paintings. Imagine going to a club and seeing Turner's paintings and the joyful faces dancing around you. Now that's truly cathartic. In the exhibition, Heaney places this painting next to Turner's Rocky Bay with Figures, exploring the self as part of nature, wild and unruly. I wonder what Turner would be like at a club dancing in 2025. Would he dance? Would he paint what he saw, what he felt? Those are the questions that Heaney's work permits us to ask. In treating Turner's paintings as living, becoming entities, Turner himself becomes less of an abstract historical figure, especially for someone like me, who works more often on the side of contemporary art than historical art, and for all of us within the context of contemporary society. So now let's look at how Heaney expands on Turner's forms. She brings them into different mediums, urging us to spend more time with the Turner paintings in the exhibition. I've already mentioned the faces. In addition to these forms showing up in the watercolors, they also come out in Heaney's embodied movements in her studio. This is another part of her practice that we don't get to see, but that contributes to the final exhibition. Heaney says that she loves how Turner paints faces, as she puts it, simplistically, and that these faces, again, how she puts it, ooze out of her movements, shadowy ghosts, warm yet haunting. In addition to the faces, we have the hill in the vision of Jacob's Ladder in the exhibition space on the left here. The more time you spend with the vision of Jacob's Ladder, the more the dark, craggy hill in the background becomes ominous. Heaney's work encourages us to imagine what might be in the landscape between the biblical foreground of Jacob's judgment, with a ladder of ascending angels, or are they tumbling angels, and this looming hill in the background. Inspired by this, she uses AI to expand on landscapes in her projected artwork on the right in the exhibition space here. So this projected artwork is titled Shadowscapes, Emotional Dumping Ground. That ominous feeling sticks with us as you view Emotional Dumping Ground. The projection seems to take us running towards the hill without ever getting us any closer to it. So we have the faces, we have this hill. Now let's talk about the tentacles in the room. The tentacle-like shapes in the landscape of Emotional Dumping Ground expand onto the floor through soft sculptural seating. They crawl up the walls of the exhibition and hang over the edge of the mezzanine balcony. In quantum, particles in superposition exist in multiple states at once. It's a non-binary system, famously illustrated by Schrödinger's cat being both alive and dead at the same time. I see the way that Heaney's visual elements are transposed and metamorphized throughout the exhibition as putting these tentacly elements into superposition, existing in Emotional Dumping Ground in the projection, across the gallery floors, and even in Turner's paintings. Suddenly, the bending tree in Turner's vision of Jacob's Ladder becomes a tentacle too, the same slender curving form ending in a point. Standing in front of Turner's painting with this tentacle context, I find my mind trying to make sense of what is in front of me. I know it's a tree. That's how I first read it. That's how it's meant to be read, especially from afar. But through Heaney's work, it becomes a kraken rising from the foamy waves. This form, this tree become kraken, become brain twister, does not really need to be one thing or another to have meaning. By drawing attention to it, Heaney points out its importance as a striking and unsettling feature in Turner's painting. Just as the tree form becomes confused within the context of Heaney's work, I'm similarly unsure of if my eyes are playing tricks on me in front of the rocky bay with figures. In the exhibition, there are silicon casts of Heaney's hands coming out of the tentacles, and they sneak their way across the gallery floors. So I kind of look at this and say, is that a curved, curled up hand in the bottom left of Rocky Bay? This painting is unfinished, so how juicy is this, to have an unfinished work truly in a state of becoming in an exhibition that uses quantum as a lens to see the world. Turner's loose style lends itself to a quantum metaphor anyway, with blurry edges that mirror the non-binary entangled nature of quantum physics. The edge is both sea and sky, both sand and sea. This is even more pronounced in this unfinished painting. You see Turner trying out where a ship or a mountain might ultimately end up, with multiple shadowy forms on the horizon. In quantum physics, you can know the position of a particle or its speed, not both at the same time. The ship's position can be imagined for an instant, but is it moving? It moves across the horizon, but which ghost outline is actually the ship? Quantum time is nonlinear, so the ship is both in front of where it is and behind of where it is. Heaney plays with a quantum notion of time in her own painting too, choosing watercolor exactly for this reason. As she explains, even if a layer of paint is dry, the next one I apply disrupts all previous layers, creating a sense of nonlinear time and how the painting was formed. Perhaps the most surprising way that Heaney expands on Turner's forms, though, is through sound. What does a painting sound like? What do the emotions sound like that a painting lets us access? Using digital images of each of the 3 paintings in the exhibition, Heaney has coded a bespoke instrument that plays these paintings line by line in a work titled Wilderness Within. She writes that, like quantum particles, our shadow sides are not accessible directly, but appear through dreams, visions, our interactions with others, and by asking a really close friend. All of these processes inform this work. The audio that comes out of these processes is sometimes eerie or disquieting. You feel the bass thump in your chest like your heart pounding in a moment of unease. But the bass is also rhythmic, reminding us that we can dance to these emotions and make something beautiful of them. Other times, Wilderness Within sounds light, cleansing almost. It feels this way most to me in the bright sky of Rocky Bay with Figures, a painting that Heaney relates to the golden shadow. I'm actually not sure of how I feel listening to Hero of 100 Fights, the third Turner painting in the exhibition, which makes sense in a lot of ways. For Heaney, this painting represents themes of technology, and while technology is ingrained in our everyday lives, I have mixed feelings about it. Through Heaney's expansion on Turner's forms and on his content, I find myself grappling with contradictions. We want to make sense of the world, put it in orderly boxes of this is a tree, this is a horizon line, this makes me feel good, this makes me feel bad. Heaney accesses her shadow self to show it isn't this simple. So can light and dark exist in the same place and the same time together? The coexistence and contradictions is what Shadowscapes is all about. A shadow only exists with light. The qualities in ourselves that we hide or repress can only be sought out by understanding what we decide to show openly to others. Heaney treats Turner's paintings as contemporary psychological landscapes, holding light and shadow at the same time, coexisting as our emotions do. A Hero of 100 Fights on the right here in the exhibition space quite obviously holds light and dark on one canvas. Originally, Turner painted this as a depiction of industrial machinery, the technology of his day. Later, he reworked it to show the bronze statue of the Duke of Wellington being removed from its mold, presumably with a white-hot glow intended to be read as the blinding valor of a war hero, and was deific in its portrayal. How do we treat this as a contemporary psychological landscape? To me, it raises questions of who we honor in contemporary society and at what cost to others, like the workers sweating in the foundry. It makes me question as well who I personally hold in high esteem, or even what characteristics I valorize in others and in myself. Which of my characteristics do I show off, like a bronze statue in a halo of light, And which do I leave to eat cabbages in the dark, like the figures in the foreground of A Hero of 100 Fights? So if we have these contradictions within ourselves, how do we let our shadow selves live alongside the versions of ourselves that we present publicly? According to Carl Jung, if we do not come to terms with our shadow selves, if we continue to repress these characteristics, then we will project them onto others and onto society. Through Heaney's work, Turner's paintings help bring these shadowscapes, contradictions, and coexistences to light to come to terms with them. At the start, I mentioned that this is a self-reflective exhibition for Heaney. It is an exhibition about emotion and as a way to process emotion. Heaney's work embraces and uses new technologies. However, as with her practice in general, she places humans as part of nature with our wild and unruly emotions. Turner's dramatic landscapes of nature connect us to this, adding to how we understand Heaney's practice and to how we understand Turner. Our aims and objectives for this exhibition included growing our audience's interest in other art forms. There are people who come for Turner, not expecting to listen to a soundscape of his paintings. And there are people who come for contemporary art, many of whom have never heard of Turner before. Responses from visitors, collected by our amazingly dedicated volunteers, show how Turner fans have gotten something new out of Turner by seeing Heaney's work, and how those who came specifically for Heaney's ultra-contemporary art engage with Turner. Here are a few of my favorites. You can read through them, but I just wanted to read one. I like the utilizing of Turner, a very well-known artist, and more complex themes of the connection between science and art. Overall, I felt quite encouraged to look at Turner in a new light. So as you read through these other responses, I want to share with you what every quantum scientist that I've spoken through this project has said to me. If you think you understand quantum physics, you don't, but we should still try. So I'll finish with, if you think you understand our wild, unruly human emotions, our shadow selves, our golden shadows, then you don't, but we should still try. Thank you.
Okay, we've got some good time now for Q&A. Thank you, Julia, for ending with that slide of quotes. We had a few quotes yesterday, but actually it really kind of links back to something which has been on my mind from yesterday's paper, as I've been listening to this afternoon, which is about, and it goes back to a slide that we saw yesterday from our Petworth colleagues, where there was the audience evaluation, and I think there was 39% of visitors to the exhibition had said that the thing they want to know more about is Turner's artistic legacies and his impact on later artists. So, and that's kind of heartening, I think, because sometimes there's a sense that, you know, it's almost a kind of a marketing thing, like thinking about contemporary artists or their responses to historic art. It's just about, I don't know, playing to the pit or trying to, just an audience development thing. But actually, there's clearly a genuine appetite there. And I think what we've seen through this afternoon is how complex and enriching these perspectives are. So that was one thought I had in mind. The other thought carried over from yesterday is whether we could pick up on a point of discussion that was raised about the relationship between creative interpretation and art historical interpretation. And to kind of pose as a division or a dichotomy that there's a kind of push towards the universal and universalizing, which is what artists do. And then there's a kind of localized Turner, which is what art historians do, right? And it's localized in history, or it might be localized geographically, that you're kind of pinning the artist down. And what I'd kind of put out to the panel is thinking about the artists interpreting and then responding to Turner that you presented this afternoon. Does that dichotomy hold up? Is it that there is only kind of harsh reason and history among the art historians, and then there is something which is only emotional and open and universal on the part of the artist? So just to kind of throw that out as a first prompt, and this gives you a little bit more time to form your questions as well. We're looking for volunteers here.
I mean, I think that depends on the art historian and depends on the artist. But I guess because I've come into this as a contemporary art historian, if I can even use the word art historian for myself. So this has been truly an eye-opening conference for me. This is not the type of conference I usually attend. But I would say that the people who work on the contemporary side of art get a lot out of the historical side, and we must engage with it. There's a reason that there's these histories, and kind of what Heaney is showing us, at least putting it in the context of the exhibition at Orleans House Gallery, is that these build on each other, these layers build on each other. And yes, you can go into any exhibition. We hope, as people who put on exhibitions, you can go into any exhibition without that art historical context and enjoy it. But knowing more about it allows you to enjoy it at a deeper level or a different level. So I think that's kind of a not answer.
I'll kind of draw on that, answering not my paper, but Julia's paper, because actually I met with Libby really early on in the project and took her around Tate and looked at Turner's and talked to her about them. And I played a small part in the pictures that she ended up responding to. And I think being a Turner person amongst contemporary art historians, it goes the other way, where like speaking with Libby and going through and kind of slow looking with a contemporary artist does illuminate things, because I remember talking to Libby and she was interested in like forms and monsters, and she was picking out things in pictures that I wouldn't have normally thought to think of as a monstrous form. So it is like such a dialogue that's really interesting.
I think your question is good, a good one to pose. My answer was a bit of a cop-out that it can't be a binary. Maybe it's a lattice work. It's a lattice work of, say, the hardcore historian maybe does something else. And then others will have come maybe from magazine writing and can do something different. If we were to leave it all in the hands of historians, I think you know what type of show that's going to be every year. And if we were to leave it in the hands of others, you know what type of show you get every year. So sorry, it's not a cop-out. I would advocate for a lattice approach.
Yeah.
I don't know what to think on this. I think you're right in that modernism and that kind of whole relationship of Rothko and Bowling to it is so interesting because of this kind of shuttling between the local and the universal, the kind of particular and the total. One and the many, if you want to go very Hegel about it, which nobody does. But I think what's kind of interesting is in the Bowling case, that kind of contemporary reading, which in many ways has been to kind of shatter Bowling, shatter Turner into these very kind of localized contexts of, well, how does he reflect on this particular history? How does it reflect on kind of a very particular history of journeying from Guyana and being in New York at a particular point in time? Whereas kind of Bowling saying, no, I don't want that. I want Turner on the grand scale. I want to be in a tradition, which is quite unusual in some ways in that it's a figure we would expect to be decentering Turner, who actually is quite keen on a narrative about Turner's place in the canon, which in some ways is quite old-fashioned. And I think it's interesting. It's not just Bowling. There's others who are thinking about Turner in that way, and then others who are thinking about Turner in different ways.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there are maybe comments, observations, questions from the floor. I can see, I think down there first, and then, the row behind after.
This is a question for Kate and a comment. Someone who comes from the North Shore of the Solway Firth, I found your paper really interesting and very moving. I just wanted to ask you where you might recommend someone to see a group of Sheila Fell paintings, and also how do you feel her reputation is viewed now in Cumbria as it now is?
Yeah, thank you for that. So to just on a practical level, to see a group of the paintings is going to be quite hard because they are dispersed throughout. There was a retrospective at Tully House in Carlisle, and then it moved on, and I believe it's no longer up. But you can maybe in a library access the catalog, which would have representations of all of the paintings. And if I hear of more exhibitions that put a group, I mean, I've just heard that in Liverpool there's a Sheila Fell on view next to a Turner, not next to, but in a show with a Turner. But to see a group is quite hard because they are, there's a longer story here about the efforts that have gone into composing the catalog. But a lot of her paintings were sold within her lifetime or collected and are all over the place in quite surprising places. So Andrew and Eleanor Bradley, who are two retired scientists, professors of science and medicine in Cambridge, are who wrote this catalog. And they have a long, long relationship going all around searching for Sheila Fells in sometimes garden sheds. Somebody has one in their house and they don't really know what it is. In Carlisle, though, when the retrospective was up, there was a lovely conversation I overheard in which people from the community were looking at her potato field paintings and saying that they knew which field that they were taking place in and that they had relatives that had been potato gleaners there. So her reputation within Cumbria, I think, is pretty established. I mean, I think people do know her there in a different way than maybe the art world knows her, which is growing, certainly growing, but I've felt for a long time like I would mention her name, you might get one person that goes, oh yeah, she's fantastic. But I would love for there to be a group show in London or the South, a group show in a sense of a grouping of her work. But for right now, that's about all I can give you, unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think there's, yeah.
Thank you. This is a question for Sabo. Would it make a difference if Turner's slave slip has nothing to do with the Zong? Because it is disputed. And the most recent book about Turner and the slave trade says that it's actually to do with the continuing slave trade in the 1830s, and because there were many other jettisonings of enslaved people when they were dead. And so, there is different ways that I don't think it probably would, but I wonder what you would feel about that.
No immediate feelings. Maybe after this, I will come up with something, but it's probably true from what I've researched and learned about it. And the accounts, my own account comes from the Wilberforce Institute. I would believe them. So I've approached it with going with these facts. But if it's possible, if it's true that what you say, then this is one other moment to invoke critical fibrillation again. It's quite an important theory to introduce into this, to try to understand that. So those gaps you're referring to, yes, can be addressed.
Just what I mean is there are many, many atrocities, not just one. So it might increase your reading, not the reverse.
Then yes. Happy with the surplus.
Okay, I think we're going right to the back row.
I've not yet got that far in Sam Smiles' splendid new-looking book on Turner, the Turner and the slave trade, etc. But it is I don't think anybody has yet noticed, unless he has, there is a very overt reference in Turner's slave trade to the Arab element in it, or the North African element in it, because the ship, though it really doesn't exist as a rig in reality, has a rig which is overtly Mediterranean, i.e., it's a slightly modified Zebek rig used by the North African traders who were being finished off in terms of, at Algiers by 1824, the final sort of suppression of the North African trade. And I think that's something which is generally not remarked on. It is not a transatlantic slave or in any way that existed in history. It's an ambiguous image, in other words, which has got much wider reference than to the African trade.
I will steer clear of arguing against you or Sam Smiles. I will do that. So you're probably right, but probably a quick reaction to that probably isn't sufficient to what you've just brought up.
And just to quickly add on that, thinking about that kind of historiographical context, the bowling's been, the kind of reading of Black Atlantic and Gilroy is in some ways, I think, it's another one of those examples of the difference between a very localized context of, well, actually, maybe we could even get to the point of trying to read the slave ship into a kind of the British Navy policing the end of slavery and that kind of point in time. But I think what's so striking, both in Ruskin's reaction to it, the early 19th century reaction to it, and then its long legacy into the 20th centuries, it precisely wasn't read like that. The way that actually it's, without getting into the whole debate between a kind of intention and reading and whatever, and I think that's kind of what's so striking about that image. The way, it has become both particularized and universalized, to go back to what kind of you were starting with. Yeah.
Very briefly, and if it's true that it was to do with the desert and the North African trade, once again, Akomfrah is the person to respond to that. Because in his later films, after this from 2015, he has gone into the desert. He has walked in the desert in the UEA. So I'm making it. This is bringing to a very selfish point, but he is the right person to to respond to all of this in an impressive way, I think. So, yeah.
All right. Maybe time for one or two more. Or anything else on the floor? Yeah, we have one there.
I'll have a go. Thank you all for the enormous amount of work you must have done in your presentations. This is a term which Turner himself wouldn't know of in his lifetime, but it's cropped up several times in your talks. What do you think the influence of artificial intelligence is going to have on art from now on?
Here's a big one.
Not mine.
Give it to me. To try and inflect that without kind of having to get Parham back up here or someone. I think what's kind of interesting to link that into a thread which came up throughout all the talks is the notion of the sublime itself. And the notion of the sublime as something which is not a fixed aesthetic category, but is something which is historically determined. There's even within the gap of a few years, the debate between Kant and Burke, never mind kind of debates on the sublime going into the 19th or the 20th century, and Robert Rosenblum doing text on the sublime, and where you've got Turner and Friedrich and the great picture of Gordale Scar, which is over in the main building, right next to Barnett Newman and Rothko and Pollock. But there's an amazing essay on, weirdly, Baudelaire by Frederick Jameson, which he wrote on the very cusp of the cybernetic age in the sort of publication of William Gibson and all of these texts. I think it first came out in 1986, where he talks about what he calls, in the kind of a postmodern sublime of the internet, of a kind of disruption of the sublime into kind of this mise en abîme of reproduction, of the wire, kind of almost the dissolution of the self into a kind of network of terminals, of cyberspace, of virtuality. And I think it's kind of interesting, thinking particularly what is going on with Heaney, is to what extent now we're kind of seeing that brought out of Turner, of a reinscription of Turner into that context of how the sublime in Turner can be read for our age, of what our experience of the sublime is, rather than just, say, Burke in a very particular. Anyway.
Yeah, 100%. Also, I just wanted to clarify that Heaney doesn't just use AI in her projected artwork, Emotional Dumping Ground. That's kind of a starting point for her to extend on Turner's landscapes. And she's also visually building hand building in a way within a gaming coding way, the rest of the landscape that you see an emotional dumping ground. I think the notion that actually I've not thought of the notion of the Sublime in terms of AI, which is really something that I think I'll need to reflect on a bit more. But I also just want to say within an art historical context, AI, I mean, I said in my presentation, I feel very conflicted about technology. So I think it's very easy to scaremonger about AI, and I share many of those fears. We just don't know what the future will look like in like 5 years, maybe 2 years, maybe less. But I also think it's important to balance that out. So within an art historical context, there are organizations like Art UK who are going to be using AI to look at vast amounts of images that are in our public collections across the UK. And that will give us new data and new ways to read those images. Possibly we'll uncover artworks that we don't know were created by well-known artists that are going to help us fill the holes within art history. So yes, there's a lot to be, I don't know, unsure of with AI, but unsure of in both a positive and negative sense, like our shadow selves. It contains multitudes.
Okay, I think with an eye on the clock and thinking it's Friday afternoon, we should say a huge thank you to this afternoon's panel. Okay, so we're going to bring today's presentations to a close by inviting up Cal Barton. Cal is a writer and a teacher, a graduate of Yale University, and an alumni of the Paul Mellon Centre's Yale in London programme. And Cal's presentation takes the form of a piece of historical fiction, Varnishing Day, Ruskin, Turner, and the End of Idolatry. So if we could please welcome Cal to the stage.
All right, we have the infamous clicker here for a day of, and this is just water, by the way. Yeah, very fancy water. Thank you to the Tate and to the Paul Mellon Center for having me. I have to admit that the title that's in your program, Varnishing Day, Ruskin, Turner, and the End of Idolatry, is not my actual title. I submitted that because I felt that I needed to submit something that was sufficiently scholarly and academic. So I have the conventional sort of title, subtitle. In actual fact, I'm reading a piece of fiction that is simply titled Perspective. You are a boy, and today you are sick, too feverish to go out. You need something infinite to look into, and you must find it here in your room. You are on your stomach, on your bed, looking down at the carpet. Hair flops into your eyes. This will have to do for infinity. The patterned burgundy carpet, the vines curling into circles at the corners, the clusters of 3 green flowers, 6 petals around each circular center. You look until boredom evaporates. You look until the green flowers sway as in a breeze. You look until your eyes blur and the pattern on the carpet inhales, exhales. You are an only child. Every week you collect new evidence supporting your long-standing hypothesis that you are the exact center of the universe. The things of the world orbit around you. This week's evidence. Your eyes are closed, you are sitting on your bed, and you can sense with what feels like freakish accuracy the exact positions of your mother cutting roses in the garden, your father filling the inkwell in his study, the girl you love pinning her hair in the mirror many miles away. You see it as if you are there. Her fingers slip, the hairpin and the reflection of the hairpin fall at the same speed. There's a tinkle as the hairpin hits the table. You see this even though you are here in your bedroom at Herne Hill studying the carpet. You are not John Ruskin. The name John Ruskin refers to a shared delusion, a mythical golden boy. When your father's business partner extends a hand and addresses you as young Mr. Ruskin, or worse, the brilliant young Mr. Ruskin, know that this well-meaning wine merchant is mistaken. He is confusing you with the character you sometimes play. You are only a voice in a head. Your mother hands you the Bible. You read alternate verses, sounding out the old names. Trace the shapes made by your mother's voice. Here it rises, here it falls. You read the lines over and over. Each sentence has a shape, a color, a texture. Blessed art thou, O Lord, teach me thy statutes. With my lips have I declared all the judgments of thy mouth. Open thou mine eyes, that I may behold wondrous things out of thy law. I am a stranger in the earth. Hide not thy commandments from me. At home you sketch everything you see, but you can draw nothing from memory. So you satisfy yourself copying illustrations from a book you received on your 13th birthday, Samuel Rogers' Italy, with engravings by one Joseph Mallard William Turner. Your hand grows swift and accurate. When you travel to the continent, your rooms are always pleasant, and men take off their hats when you arrive and depart. You are happy in the Alps, sketching rocks. Here, you are nearly yourself. Here, you are nearly John Ruskin. You and your mother and father cross into Italy. You feel that you've been here before, and you have through Turner. In crowded squares, you bend over your sketchbook. You lay full length on the floor of a ruined church to better see a single detail. You think of yourself as a spectator. Your interests in writing, drawing, engraving, architecture, geology, botany, all are mere parts of a grand ambition to see everything, to leave nothing unseen. In 1836, Turner has 3 pictures in the Royal Academy. Here is a man who sees everything. You are too full of awe to feel envy. Blackwood's magazine does not share your sentiment. They call Turner's picture of Juliet and her nurse a strange jumble, streaked blue and pink and thrown into a flower tub. You are moved to write a response. You write that Turner is an exception to all rules. If he happens to place Shakespeare's Juliet in Venice rather than Verona, well, this is because Turner knows when to rewrite the truth. The mists above the distant city are not the product of a flower tub. How utterly stupid. They are blue mists like those that escape from ancient tombs. Aged 17, this is your first piece of art criticism. It is forwarded to Turner, who writes back, "My dear sir, I beg to thank you for your zeal, kindness, and the trouble you have taken on my behalf in regard to the criticism of Blackwood's magazine for October respecting my works. But I never move in these matters. They are of no import save mischief." A week after receiving Turner's letter, you enter Oxford. You've grown tall. You have a thin face, reddish hair, a prominent nose. Your speech is deliberate because you try to speak like John Ruskin. Oxford is not a postcard. The other undergraduates are lazy, they are gamblers, they are hunting and sporting men who drink and know nothing. You miss the familiar voices in your home library. Milton is too flowery, Sophocles is dismal. Virgil is never who you want him to be. But you do your work. You are the overeducated merchant's son at a table of aristocrats. You are accepted because you are exceptional. You want to win the Newdigate Prize for poetry, but your poems are weak, and the girl you love is being married off in Paris. And when you look in the mirror, you see John Ruskin, who shares your reddish hair and thin face, but is otherwise a different person entirely. And the distance between you and John Ruskin makes you sick, makes you sweat, and you cough blood, and your poems fail. You are too unwell to continue at Oxford, so you return to suburban London. At a dinner on June 22nd, 1840, you are introduced to J.M.W. Turner, the painter and poet of the day. He is not the vulgar sailor you'd been led to expect. His gaze is a sunbeam. You spend time, lots of time, at a villa of a retired coach builder who has collected some 50 Turners. The coach builder tells stories of Turner. At 14, he entered the Royal Academy. At 16, scene painter for an opera house. When the opera house caught fire one morning, Turner ran to sketch the scene. His picture of the fire was exhibited next spring. And of course, the coach builder says, he's a brilliant sailor. He once had himself tied to a shipmast like Odysseus so he could better paint the sky. It does not matter whether the stories are true. You are overcome by a knee-bouncing restlessness. Something worth writing has fallen into your lap. You begin work on a fairy tale, an English myth. It is romance. It is history. It follows a singular hero, an only child, a barber's son from Covent Garden who is the greatest painter in the world. A pamphlet becomes a volume. A volume becomes 3 volumes. You are writing the book of everything, disguised as a treatise on landscape painting. It is impossible to separate your personal history from the history of art. You leave no stone unturned. Your hero is God's rival. Over holiday, at your new home in Denmark Hill, in your study over the breakfast room, you write. You tell no one what you are writing. You defy genre. Your ambition stops at nothing. Your book is prose, is poetry, is a 500-page sermon. You are 24 years old. Modern Painters is sent to press and in shops by the first week of May, 1843. You sign the book, a graduate of Oxford, because you do not know who wrote it, you or Ruskin. Wordsworth declares you a brilliant writer. Elizabeth Browning expects you will enjoy a long career, says it is a great thing for a critic to be so much of a poet. George Eliot calls you a prophet. Charlotte Bronte writes, "This book seems to give me eyes." Of course, these compliments are not for you. They are for John Ruskin, who has become a celebrity, whose golden boy status only grows. You attend parties where people dance under dim chandeliers. When you are asked if you are Mr. Ruskin, you wince. You listen to the opinions of jealous people whose houses are filled with the wrong art. Empty conversations drone in the half-dark. Someone tortures an old piano. Someone slips and falls. A young woman claims acquaintance with you. You get away as soon as you can and ask who she is. Lady something, you forget. You stand with your back to the wall and look at your watch. As a congratulatory gift, your father buys you a Turner shown at the Royal Academy in 1840. The very picture you claim in Modern Painters to be the noblest sea ever painted by man. The picture's full title is Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On. It hangs in your entry. You pass it in the morning when you go to the breakfast room. You pass it at night when you retire to your study. Your paragraph describing the picture is famous, the kind of paragraph that demands to be read aloud. It burns like gold and bathes like blood. But now that the picture is part of your daily life, you think nothing of it. You walk past the shackled black feet of the drowned. On certain days, you think the picture too beautiful to be good. Turner stands before a lecture diagram, a drawing of warped reflections in 3 polished spheres. For 30 years, Turner was professor of perspective at the Royal Academy, and now he has returned as an honored guest. He is a genius. He is the true and only witness. He knows that water is made of light. He knows that any color could be the color of a river. He knows that some rain comes from the sky and some rain comes from the sea, and some rain falls but never hits the ground. He knows some raindrops fall in pairs, and some in clusters, and some put up a fight against gravity, and in these slow-falling droplets you can see your reflection for the slightest moment. Turner knows when the sea is one surface rippling, and when the sea is an inappropriate term that assigns unity to a series of waves so distinct that each deserves a first and last name. He knows the sun is God, and the sea is God, and the sky is God. He knows all this, and he puts that knowledge onto canvas. But he is a terrible lecturer. From the back of the room, you hear almost nothing. This is the hero of your narrative, this man who mispronounces mathematics, who stumbles over simple words, who loses his place and shuffles through handwritten notes, unsure where he left off. It occurs to you that maybe, all this time, you were writing about someone else. You see a lot of Turner now. He sells you watercolors, he offers you wine, but he never mentions your book. Turner is an old man. You attend exhibitions together, and when you critique the work of a contemporary, Turner looks at you and says, "You don't know how difficult it is." This cannot be the man you wrote about. In the Mirror, John Ruskin is cruel as ever, emboldened by the success of modern painters, and the thin, reflected face declares that Turner has nothing more to offer you. You shake your head. It cannot be true. John Ruskin says you must leave for Europe. You must flee far from here. The choice is this: continue praising the great but fading man, or escape and become John Ruskin. Wouldn't it be nice not to fight with the mirror? You cannot serve 2 masters. When you stop at Queen Anne Street to bid farewell to Turner, he grips your arm and says, "Why will you go to Switzerland? There'll be such a fidge about you when you're gone." You are 26. You look in Turner's eyes and see something gentle working behind his gaze. And the thought arrives that this barber's son from Covent Garden is well aware that Joseph Mallard William Turner is a myth. Even this man self-narrates in the second person. You leave for the continent. You never speak to Turner again. Thank you.
Thank you, Cal, for bringing the kind of formal proceedings to such a brilliant and rather kind of elegant close, and the sort of summation of Turner's life and creativity there is kind of really brought centre stage again. So thank you for that. We've built in a little bit of time. I think this is kind of decompression time, isn't it? Before we send people back out into the world, and probably won't be daylight out there, but you know, the last flickers of the sun and the real world out there, because it's been it's been an intense 2 days. We've covered a lot of ground, but we wanted to just take a moment now to offer some acknowledgements and thanks, and then some quick reflections on what these days have meant to us, and maybe what happens next as well. So, Amy.
Okay. This podium thing.
The podium is a one-person podium, so we're going to be like...
Let's have one for each, shall we?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking back to when I thought, Turner 250 was looming for me a long, long time ago. And I envisaged having a conference at the end of it because I thought, you know, really we're the home of Turner. We should be flying that flag, you know, loud and proud. And wouldn't it be fantastic to convene so many people, you know, see who's out there, you know, scholars who've been working on Turner for decades, those who are up and coming. Wouldn't it be fantastic to gather everybody? But at that time, it was just a pipe dream because I had neither the resource nor, you know, colleagues to help work through it. So it's yeah, it's really been fantastic to see it come to fruition. And the call for papers, I feel, you know, I feel really delighted with how you've all responded to the call for papers. You know, we kept it quite open and deliberately asked for creative responses as well as academic, scholarly responses, so that we could really truly get that, you know, take the temperature of just, you know, how exciting Turner can be for people who come at him from all different angles, you know, whether they're into quantum physics or, you know, whether you're a poet or whether you're an art historian or whatever you see in his work. I think, you know, time and time again, all of us who work on Turner, it's a cliche to say, but there's so much in his work that we can then get out of his work so much as well. And I think over the course of the 2 days, we've been zooming in and out, and it's been really fantastic. So thank you to everyone for the work that you've put in to make this such a rich couple of days. Do you want to say anything else, or should I go on to thank yous?
Do the thank yous.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, thinking that it was just a pipe dream. First of all, thank you very, very much to the Manton Foundation, because without their gift of financial support, we wouldn't have been able to convene everybody here. We wouldn't have been able to get speakers from across the world. So that is really the enabling gift. Also, the Turner Society. It was a really lovely thing to have you offer to collaborate with us and to offer bursaries for particularly emerging scholars and speakers. So that's been lovely too. To the Paul Mellon Centre, to Sarah Turner, Martin Myrone, Ella Fleming, Kathleen Ward and Feme Oliade, all the speakers and chairs, and my Tate colleagues. These two are not here today, but Isabel Wilkins-Smith and Graham Rockhill behind the scenes sorted out those tickets for various people for the exhibition and also the finances too. The AV team, Harv, Laurie, Isa and Matt Lloyd up there, and the events team, Tony and especially Eden as well, have dealt with all of this. You know, we don't do this so often, not as often as we should, and they've dealt with everything very, very well. Tate Eats for the catering, Courtauld short courses for the loan of some equipment for our Turnerian walking tour this morning. The amazing Cayenne Quartet, which Tim brought in last night. And then to VE staff, especially Pam, who's been helping everybody find what they need around. And last but not least, I really want to thank Nicole and Morby, who's been very quietly arranging things for the past couple of days and the past couple of months. She, I sort of landed this in her lap, and she picked up the organisation of this really very complex event and has delivered it really marvellously, making sure that everyone, you know, including a string quartet from yesterday, knew where they were going, what they were doing, you know, had everything that they needed. And on top of that, chairing a session yesterday and taking speakers on a fantastic walking tour of Turner's London this morning. So thank you so much, Nicola. I want to give Nicola a round of applause. And let's move on.
Great. Okay. So just a kind of final reflections, and I'm going to ask for one other big round of applause, but don't do it yet. So kind of asking the question, well, what have we seen and what have we heard over the last 2 days? I mean, you probably all have your own impressions, but we've heard about cataloguing as a real foundation for kind of art historical research, but also for curating and audience engagement and thinking with art. We have heard a really kind of detailed, intensive art historical research on specific topics, including topics which have perhaps been marginal within Turner studies, or pictures which haven't been thought about or seen in the same way as some other iconic works. And those iconic works have circulated around and resurfaced from paper to paper, with new things being said and discovered about them each time. But we've seen research and thinking as well, which has a very strong sense of the relevance of this work to wider issues, so ecological, cultural, political, personal. And we've heard a lot about curatorial work. We've heard from poets and writers and painters offering their perspectives. And we've heard about the interplay between visual art and music. I mean, this has been 2 days which have not been about, Turner studies as a concrete and bounded field, but as something which is really expansive and imaginative and engaging. So what happens next? I don't know, actually. I mean, I'm looking at you, Amy. No, it's not. I've written something down, don't worry, it's all right. What happens next? And we've been hearing at various points, and I'm sure in conversation as well, that individuals and organisations are making very active use of this online catalogue. And with the final kind of elements of the catalogue reaching completion, I'm sure it's going to become even more true in future. This is a kind of major reference point within art history and curating, and for everybody who's got an interest in art and the art of Turner. But, it's a model really for how a collection can be opened up and made available and become a resource for everybody. Emma Roothouse, I think it is somewhere still. She's not here, I won't look around for her. She flagged yesterday that next year it's Constable's turn, right? So it's Constable 250 next year, 2026. And we know there's going to be a conference and there's going to be a lot of exhibition activity in Ipswich and around and other places too. So Constable next, 1 year apart, Turner and Constable. What a good, oh yeah, there you go. We've done that now. And the Paul Mellon Centre will be contributing in part to that Constable 250 programme, and it will be doing so as part of a programme of curatorial research focused on Turner and on Constable and their contemporaries and their legacies, also involving Turner Contemporary at Margate, Bristol Museum and Art Gallery, and working in collaboration with Tate and the new Manton Centre at the Courtauld. And we've just announced that, so do check your inboxes for your PMC mailing. I'm sure you're on the newsletter list, and do watch this space. And with all this in mind, I think, Amy, you'd be optimistic. I think there's a general air of optimism about the state of the field. Not only Turner, not only Constable, but thinking about landscape painting and thinking about historic British art more generally. The last 2 days have been fruitful and inspiring in all sorts of different ways. We've seen detailed research and we've seen academic rigour, not least in relation to the catalogue and the cataloguing of Turner's work, but this is also set really comfortably and in a way which I think feels very fresh and forward-looking, sat very comfortably between other approaches, curatorial, audience-focused, and creative and imaginative. And we have a sense, I think, of a future which is not only about the stories that the experts tell us about landscape painting or about Turner, the stories which are sort of handed down, but also the stories that everyone might bring. And if Turner remains, as I think everybody behind Turner and Constable and this conference would like to think, if Turner remains relevant and engaging, it is because of the kinds of dialogue and personal engagement that his work inspires. And that takes me to ask you for a final act before you're allowed out into the world and you return to reality, which is one last huge round of applause, firstly for all the contributors and the team behind, well, the exhibition, because you'll have seen that, but certainly these last 2 days, but also a round of applause really to each other as participants in this, because if you weren't here, it'd be kind of weird, wouldn't it? You would just be talking to an empty room, and that's no fun. But generally, because it's the conversations that are happening in this room, and your contributions, and the conversations which are happening in the foyer, which make an event like this worth happening. And we've overheard the conversations, we've seen them taking place, and that's really why we want something like this to happen, because it creates the chance for conversation, for different perspectives, and for the kind of energy that we felt. I don't know if it's the Northumbria water or if it's Turner. There's something which has kind of created a real energy here. So, as a final act, please, a huge round of applause to yourselves and to our contributors. And that, I think, is it. So, see you soon.